In a small, peaceful town surrounded by lush green fields and quiet streets, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. People knew each other by name, and the biggest news of the week was often about someone's wedding or a new baby being born. But one fateful morning, an incident occurred that shattered the calmness and left the entire community in shock. It all began with Mrs. Devi, a kind-hearted elderly woman who had lived in this town for most of her life but was now visiting after years away. Mrs. Devi was no ordinary woman. She was the mother of Arun Kumar, the country's justice minister. Despite her son's high-profile position, she preferred to live a simple life. She loved spending time in her hometown, where she could reconnect with old friends, walk through familiar streets, and enjoy the fresh air without the constant noise of the city. This particular day started like any other. The sun was shining brightly, birds chirped cheerfully, and the market buzzed with activity as farmers displayed their freshest produce. Mrs. Devi decided to visit the local vegetable market to buy supplies for her stay. Dressed in a modest cotton sari, carrying a woven basket over her arm, she strolled leisurely down the narrow lanes of the bazaar. Vendors greeted her warmly, recognizing her as someone who had grown up in the area. She smiled back, exchanging pleasantries and carefully selecting ripe tomatoes, crisp cucumbers, and fragrant herbs. As she paid for her purchases, she felt content, almost nostalgic, remembering how these same streets had been part of her childhood. But little did she know, this serene morning would soon turn chaotic. After finishing her shopping, Mrs. Devi stepped out onto the main road, ready to head back home. That's when trouble found her. Two police officers approached her abruptly, their expressions stern and accusatory. One of them pointed at her and demanded to know why she hadn't paid the parking fee for her car. Confused, Mrs. Devi stopped in her tracks. "I don't have a car here," she replied calmly, holding her basket close to her chest. "I came by bus." Her voice carried the tone of someone used to resolving misunderstandings peacefully. However, the officers didn't seem interested in listening. They exchanged skeptical glances before insisting that she must be hiding something. "We saw you parked near the corner," one of them said firmly. "Don't try to deny it." Mrs. Devi shook her head, explaining once again that she hadn't driven into town. But the officers grew impatient. Their demeanor shifted from questioning to aggressive. Without warning, one of them grabbed her wrist tightly, causing her to wince in pain. "Let go of me," she protested, trying to pull away. But the officer only tightened his grip, dragging her toward the side of the road. Meanwhile, the second officer began rummaging through her basket, scattering vegetables across the ground. Tomatoes rolled under parked motorcycles. Cucumbers were crushed underfoot, and the scent of bruised herbs filled the air. By now, a crowd had gathered. Passers-by stopped to watch the unfolding scene, their faces etched with disbelief. Some whispered, among themselves, wondering what could have possibly led to such behavior from the police. Others stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene. For Mrs. Devi, the humiliation was unbearable. Here she was, a respected elder, known for her kindness and humility, being treated like a criminal in front of everyone she'd known for decades. Tears welled up in her eyes as she pleaded with the officers to stop. "Please, I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling. But they ignored her, continuing their search as if determined to find evidence of some imaginary wrongdoing. The situation escalated further when one of the officers raised his voice, accusing Mrs. Devi of resisting authority. "You think you're above the law?" he barked, his tone laced with anger. His partner chimed in, calling her stubborn and uncooperative. By this point, several onlookers had pulled out their phones, recording the incident. One young man captured the entire confrontation on video, capturing every detail: the rough handling, the scattered vegetables, and Mrs. Devi's obvious distress. He later uploaded the footage online, unaware that it would soon ignite a firestorm of outrage across the nation. As the ordeal dragged on, Mrs. Devi's strength began to wane. Physically frail and emotionally drained, she struggled to keep standing. Finally, after what felt like hours, the officers relented. With nothing incriminating found in her basket, they muttered something about wasting their time and walked away, leaving her alone amidst the mess they had created. Shaken but determined not to let them see her cry, Mrs. Devi bent down to pick up what remained of her groceries. A few kind-hearted neighbors rushed to help, offering words of comfort and support. Word of the incident spread quickly. Within hours, the whole town knew what had happened. People expressed their shock and anger, questioning how such a thing could occur in their otherwise peaceful community. Many felt a deep sense of injustice, not just for Mrs. Devi, but for anyone who might fall victim to similar treatment. Rumors swirled about the officers' motives, with some speculating that they may have targeted her because of her age or perceived vulnerability. Others wondered if there was more to the story, though no one could imagine what it might be. Back at her son's house, Mrs. Devi tried to compose herself. She called her daughter, Mira, to share what had happened. Mira listened in stunned silence, her heart breaking for her mother. When she hung up, she immediately reached out to her brother, Arun Kumar. As the Justice Minister, Arun was accustomed to dealing with crises, but nothing could have prepared him for this call. Hearing his mother recount the events left him seething with rage, not just as a son but as someone who had sworn to uphold justice. How could this happen? To his own mother? In broad daylight? That evening, the video of the incident went viral. Social media platforms lit up with reactions ranging from disbelief to fury. Comments poured in from people across the country, expressing solidarity with Mrs. Devi and condemning the actions of the officers. Hashtags like "Justice for Mrs. Devi" and "Police Accountability" trended nationwide. Journalists scrambled to cover the story, eager to uncover the truth behind the shocking footage. What had started as a quiet morning in a sleepy town had become a national sensation overnight. Meanwhile, Mrs. Devi retreated to her room, exhausted and overwhelmed. Though she appreciated the outpouring of support, she couldn't shake off the feeling of shame. She had always believed in treating others with respect and dignity, even during disagreements. Now she wondered if she had somehow failed to live up to those values. Little did she know her experience would soon spark a movement far greater than she could have ever imagined, a movement that would challenge the very foundations of power and accountability in society. And so the stage was set for what would come next, a journey filled with revelations, resistance, and ultimately hope for change. The morning after the incident, Mrs. Devi woke up feeling heavy-hearted. The events of the previous day replayed in her mind like a broken record. She could still feel the tight grip of the officer's hand on her wrist and hear their harsh voices, accusing her of things she hadn't done. Though physically unharmed, the emotional toll was immense. She had always prided herself on being strong, someone who faced life's challenges with grace and resilience. But this was different. This wasn't just an isolated act of rudeness, it was an assault on her dignity, carried out by people whose job was to protect her. Her son, Arun Kumar, was still reeling from the phone call he had received the night before. As the Justice Minister, he was no stranger to difficult situations. He had spent years advocating for fairness and accountability in the legal system, working tirelessly to ensure that justice was served without bias or favoritism. Yet nothing could have prepared him for this moment, when his own mother became the victim of the very kind of injustice he fought against every day. It was deeply personal, cutting through layers of professional detachment and striking at the core of who he was as a son and as a leader. Determined to understand exactly what had happened, Arun called his sister Mira, first thing in the morning. "Tell me everything Mama said," he urged, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Mira recounted the details, describing how their mother had been harassed, humiliated, and treated like a criminal in front of everyone she knew. Arun clenched, his fists as he listened, trying hard to suppress the anger bubbling inside him. When Mira finished, there was silence on the line for a moment. Then Arun spoke, his tone firm and resolute. "This isn't just about Mama anymore. This is about sending a message that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law." Arun wasted no time taking action. He instructed his trusted team of advisors and lawyers to investigate the incident thoroughly. Every detail mattered: the names of the officers involved, their past records, any potential motives behind targeting his mother, and whether higher authorities had played a role in covering up the truth. At the same time, he reached out to senior police officials, demanding an explanation for what had transpired. His calls were met with vague reassurances and promises of internal inquiries, but Aaron wasn't satisfied. He knew all too well how these cases often ended, with empty apologies and little real accountability. Meanwhile, news of the incident continued to dominate headlines. The video recorded by the young man at the scene had gone viral, sparking outrage across the nation. Social media platforms buzzed with heated discussions. Some users praised Mrs. Devi for remaining calm despite the mistreatment, while others condemned the officer's behavior as unacceptable and shameful. Memes mocking the police spread rapidly, along with hashtags calling for reforms in law enforcement. Journalists descended upon the small town, eager to interview witnesses and gather more information. The quiet streets that had once been filled with laughter and chatter now echoed with the clicking of cameras and shouted questions. For Mrs. Devi, the sudden attention was overwhelming. Neighbors came knocking at her door, offering condolences, and sharing stories of similar experiences they or their loved ones had endured. One elderly woman tearfully recounted how her grandson had been beaten by police during a routine traffic stop. Another neighbor described how her daughter had been detained overnight for questioning over a minor misunderstanding. Each story added fuel to the growing fire of public discontent. Though Mrs. Devi appreciated the support, she couldn't help but feel uneasy. She had never sought the spotlight, and the thought of becoming a symbol of resistance made her uncomfortable. Despite her reluctance, Mrs. Devi agreed to give a brief statement to the press, encouraged by her children. Sitting on the porch of her son's house, flanked by Aaron and Mira, she spoke softly but clearly. "I am not here to accuse anyone," she began, her hands clasped tightly together. "But I want to ask, is this how we treat our elders? Is this how we treat ordinary citizens? I did nothing wrong, yet I was treated like a criminal. If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." Her words struck a chord with millions of viewers, many of whom saw themselves in her plight. By the end of the day, clips of her statement had been shared thousands of times online. As the public outcry intensified, pressure mounted on local authorities to take swift action. The two officers involved in the incident were temporarily suspended pending further investigation. However, whispers of a cover-up began circulating almost immediately. According to sources within the police department, senior officials had instructed the duo to claim they didn't recognize Mrs. Devi and had simply mistaken her for someone else. These rumors only fueled suspicions of corruption and abuse of power, adding another layer of complexity to an already explosive situation. Back in the capital, Aaron faced mounting scrutiny from both supporters and critics. Supporters hailed him as a champion of justice, applauding his efforts to hold the police accountable. Critics, however, accused him of exploiting the incident for political gain, suggesting that he was using his mother's ordeal to distract from other pressing issues. Opposition leaders seized the opportunity to attack his administration, calling for independent oversight committees to investigate not just this case, but systemic flaws in law enforcement nationwide. For Arun, navigating this delicate balance was challenging. He understood the criticisms but refused to let them deter him from pursuing the truth. In private moments, Arun found himself reflecting on his mother's strength. Despite everything she had endured, she remained composed, refusing to let bitterness consume her. Her resilience inspired him to push harder, not just for her sake, but for the countless others who might never have the platform to speak out. Late one night, sitting alone in his study, he drafted a plan. It included proposals for stricter regulations governing police conduct, mandatory body cameras for all officers, and independent review boards to handle complaints of misconduct. He also envisioned educational programs aimed at fostering better relationships between law enforcement and the communities they served. By midweek, the investigation yielded its first significant breakthrough. Documents obtained by Arun's team revealed troubling patterns in the officers' past behavior. Both men had multiple complaints filed against them for excessive force, verbal abuse, and racial profiling. In each case, disciplinary actions had been minimal, a slap on the wrist at best. Worse still, some of the complainants claimed they had been pressured into dropping their cases after receiving threats or bribes. These findings painted a grim picture of a system riddled with impunity and corruption. When this information was leaked to the media, public fury reached new heights. Protesters took to the streets in cities across the country, holding placards that read "Justice for all" and "No one is above the law." Students organized rallies on university campuses, chanting slogans and singing songs of solidarity. Even celebrities joined the movement, using their platforms to amplify the call for change. The momentum was undeniable, and it seemed as though the entire nation had united under a single cause, holding those in power accountable. Amidst the chaos, Mrs. Devi received a visit from a group of local activists. They brought flowers and heartfelt messages of gratitude, thanking her for inspiring so many to stand up against injustice. Though touched by their kindness, she couldn't shake off a sense of unease. "I didn't ask for this," she told them gently. "I just wanted to buy vegetables and go home." Her humility resonated deeply with the visitors, reinforcing the idea that true courage often lies in simplicity. As days turned into weeks, the story of Mrs. Devi and the Justice Minister evolved, from a personal tragedy into a national reckoning. What started as an isolated act of harassment had exposed deep-rooted issues within society, issues that could no longer be ignored. And while the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, one thing was certain: the seeds of change had been planted, and they would continue to grow, nurtured by the collective determination of millions. The investigation into the incident involving Mrs. Devi and the two police officers deepened, uncovering layers of corruption and misconduct that shocked even seasoned investigators. As Arun Kumar's legal team delved further into the matter, they uncovered documents, testimonies, and evidence that painted a disturbing picture of systemic abuse within the local police force. What had initially seemed like an isolated act of harassment was quickly spiraling into something much larger, a scandal that threatened to expose decades of unchecked power and impunity. At the center of it all was Mrs. Devi herself, who found herself thrust into the role of a reluctant symbol. Despite her discomfort with the attention, she couldn't ignore the growing movement inspired by her ordeal. Every day, more people reached out to share their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Some recounted being stopped arbitrarily on the streets. Others spoke of violent encounters during protests or peaceful gatherings. One young woman described how she had been detained overnight for questioning, simply because she happened to be walking near a crime scene. Another man shared how his elderly father had been beaten for refusing to pay a bribe to avoid a traffic ticket. These accounts poured in from across the country, each one reinforcing the need for urgent reform. Meanwhile, the two officers involved in Mrs. Devi's case, Officer Ramesh and Officer Vikram, were under intense scrutiny. Their suspension had only fueled public curiosity about their past actions. Records showed that both men had served in various districts over the years, leaving behind trails of complaints wherever they went. In one instance, a shopkeeper accused them of extorting money in exchange for not filing false charges. In another, a teenager claimed they had beaten him after stopping him for riding his bicycle without lights. Yet in every single case, the complaints had been dismissed due to lack of evidence, or so it seemed. Aaron's team discovered that many of these dismissals weren't as straightforward as they appeared. Internal memos revealed that senior officials had intervened repeatedly, pressuring victims to withdraw their allegations or intimidating witnesses into silence. Bribery played a significant role too. Wealthy individuals with connections to powerful politicians often paid off victims to keep quiet. For ordinary citizens like Mrs. Devi, there was little hope of justice when facing such a rigged system. As this information came to light, public outrage intensified. Protesters gathered outside police stations in major cities, demanding accountability and transparency. Students organized marches carrying banners with slogans like "Enough is enough" and "Reform now." Even celebrities joined the chorus, using their platforms to amplify the voices of those affected. Social media remained ablaze with discussions, hashtags, and petitions calling for immediate action. The pressure became impossible to ignore. For Aaron, the mounting evidence presented both a challenge and an opportunity. On one hand, he knew that exposing the truth would come at a cost. Powerful figures within the government and law enforcement were bound to resist any attempts to dismantle the status quo. Allies warned him that pushing too hard could alienate key supporters and jeopardize his political career. But on the other hand, Arun saw this as a chance to enact real change, not just for his mother but for everyone who had suffered silently under similar circumstances. He decided to push forward, no matter the consequences. One of the most explosive revelations emerged when a whistleblower stepped forward. An anonymous source from within the police department leaked audio recordings of conversations between senior officials discussing ways to suppress evidence related to Mrs. Devi's case. In one recording, a high-ranking officer instructed subordinates to fabricate a story claiming they hadn't recognized Mrs. Devi during the altercation. "Make sure you stick to the script," the voice said coldly. "We don't want this blowing up into something bigger than it already is." Another recording revealed plans to discredit Mrs. Devi by spreading rumors about her supposedly privileged background. "If we can paint her as someone trying to play the victim card, people will lose sympathy," one official suggested. The audacity of these schemes left listeners stunned. When the tapes were released to the media, the nation erupted in anger. Trust in law enforcement plummeted overnight, with calls for resignations echoing nationwide. Protests grew larger and louder, spilling onto highways and blocking major intersections. In some areas, demonstrators clashed with riot police, leading to tense standoffs. Opposition leaders seized the moment to demand sweeping reforms, proposing bills aimed at increasing oversight and accountability. Even members of Arun's own party began voicing concerns, urging him to take decisive action before the situation spiraled completely out of control. Back in the small town where it all began, life felt surreal. Once familiar streets now buzzed with reporters and activists, while residents struggled to reconcile the idyllic image of their community with the harsh realities exposed by the scandal. For Mrs. Devi, returning to normalcy seemed impossible. Friends and neighbors continued to visit, offering support and sharing stories of their own experiences with injustice. Though grateful for their kindness, she couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet life had been irrevocably changed. During this time, Arun visited his mother frequently, updating her on the progress of the investigation. He also sought her advice, knowing that her perspective as a victim was invaluable. Sitting together in the evenings, they discussed what meaningful reform might look like. Arun proposed ideas such as mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent review, boards to investigate complaints, and stricter penalties for abuse of power. Mrs. Devi listened intently, nodding occasionally but saying little. Her silence spoke volumes. She understood the importance of what her son was doing, but she couldn't help feeling overwhelmed by the scale of it all. Despite the challenges, Arun remained resolute. He announced plans to introduce comprehensive legislation aimed at addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. His proposals included measures to improve training programs, foster better relationships between police and communities, and establish clear guidelines for disciplinary actions. Critics accused him of overreaching, arguing that such sweeping changes would undermine the authority of law enforcement agencies. Supporters, however, hailed his efforts as long overdue, praising him for finally tackling problems that had plagued the system for generations. As weeks turned into months, the momentum behind the movement showed no signs of slowing down. Public forums were held in cities and towns across the country, giving citizens a platform to voice their grievances and propose solutions. Grassroots organizations sprang up, dedicated to advocating for police reform and supporting victims of misconduct. Artists created murals and performances inspired by Mrs. Devi's story, turning her experience into a rallying cry for justice. Behind the scenes, negotiations between government officials, law enforcement representatives, and civil society groups grew increasingly heated. Some argued for incremental changes, fearing that drastic measures might destabilize the system. Others pushed for bold reforms, insisting that anything less would fail to address the root causes of the problem. Aaron found himself caught in the middle, balancing competing interests while staying true to his vision of a fairer, more accountable society. Through it all, Mrs. Devi remained a steadfast presence. Though she rarely spoke publicly, her quiet dignity and unwavering resolve inspired countless others to join the fight for justice. Her story served as a reminder that change often begins with the courage to stand up, even when the odds seem insurmountable. And though the road ahead promised to be long and difficult, one thing was certain: the seeds of transformation had been sown, and they would continue to grow, nurtured by the collective determination of millions. As the investigation into Mrs. Devi's case reached its climax, the nation held its breath. What started as a single incident of police harassment had snowballed into a full-blown exposé of corruption and abuse within the law enforcement system. The evidence against Officer Ramesh and Officer Vikram was overwhelming. Dozens of past complaints, leaked audio recordings implicating senior officials in cover-ups, and mounting public pressure all pointed to one inevitable conclusion: justice could no longer be delayed. The trial began in a packed courtroom, with journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens crowding outside to catch even a glimpse of the proceedings. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Lawyers representing the two officers argued that their actions toward Mrs. Devi were simply a misunderstanding, a result of poor communication rather than malice or misconduct. They claimed the officers hadn't recognized her identity and had acted based on standard protocol. But prosecutors countered this narrative with irrefutable facts. Documents showed a pattern of behavior so consistent that it left little room for doubt. These men weren't just guilty of harassing an elderly woman. They were emblematic of a broken system that prioritized power over people. Mrs. Devi herself attended the trial, sitting quietly alongside her son, Arun Kumar. Her presence loomed large in the courtroom, not because she sought vengeance, but because her dignity demanded accountability. She listened intently as witness after witness took the stand, recounting harrowing tales of encounters with the same officers. A young man described being beaten for refusing to pay a bribe. A shopkeeper tearfully recalled how his business suffered after being falsely accused of selling stolen goods. Each testimony added weight to the prosecution's case, painting a damning portrait of unchecked authority. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came when a whistleblower, an insider from the police department, was called to testify. This individual, whose face remained hidden behind a screen to protect their identity, provided explosive details about how senior officials had orchestrated attempts to suppress evidence related to Mrs. Devi's case. According to the whistleblower, meetings were held where strategies were devised to discredit Mrs. Devi and shift blame onto her family. One particularly chilling detail emerged. A high-ranking officer had allegedly instructed subordinates to plant false information online, suggesting that Mrs. Devi had staged the entire incident to gain sympathy and political leverage. When this testimony hit the headlines, public outrage reached fever pitch. Protesters poured into the streets once again, holding signs that read, "No more lies" and "Justice without fear." Social media platforms buzzed with renewed energy, as hashtags like "Truth will prevail" trended worldwide. People demanded not only convictions for the officers involved, but also resignations from those higher up who had facilitated the attempted cover-up. The scandal had grown beyond a local issue. It was now a national reckoning. As the trial progressed, cracks began to show within the ranks of law enforcement. Several junior officers broke their silence, speaking out about the culture of fear and intimidation that pervaded the force. They revealed how whistleblowers were often ostracized or punished, while those who followed orders without question climbed the ranks quickly. These revelations painted a grim picture of an institution rotting from within, where loyalty to superiors mattered more than service to the community. For Arun Kumar, the unfolding drama presented both challenges and opportunities. As Justice Minister, he faced mounting pressure to deliver tangible results. Critics accused him of exploiting his mother's ordeal for personal gain, while supporters praised him for standing firm despite immense scrutiny. Privately, Aaron grappled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt pride in seeing the movement inspired by his mother gaining momentum. On the other hand, he couldn't escape the pain of knowing that his own flesh and blood had suffered so deeply at the hands of those sworn to protect her. Determined to channel the growing momentum toward meaningful reform, Aaron introduced a sweeping legislative package aimed at transforming the way law enforcement operated. His proposals included mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent oversight boards to investigate complaints of misconduct, and stricter penalties for abuse of power. He also advocated for improved training programs focused on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. While some lawmakers resisted these changes, citing concerns about cost and implementation, public support gave Aaron the leverage he needed to push forward. Back in her hometown, Mrs. Devi continued to navigate life under the spotlight. Though she appreciated the outpouring of solidarity, she longed for the simplicity of her old routine. Friends and neighbors still visited regularly, bringing updates from protests and sharing stories of how her courage had inspired them to speak out. One day, a group of students arrived at her doorstep, presenting her with handmade cards and letters expressing gratitude for her bravery. Moved by their sincerity, Mrs. Devi thanked them warmly, reminding them that true strength lies in standing up for what is right, even when it feels impossible. Meanwhile, the verdict in the trial finally arrived. After weeks of deliberation, the judge delivered a scathing indictment of Officer Ramesh and Officer Vikram, convicting them on multiple counts of misconduct and abuse of power. Both men were sentenced to prison terms, marking a rare instance of accountability in cases involving law enforcement. Senior officials implicated in the cover-up faced consequences too, with several resigning amid scandals and investigations. For many, the verdict represented a small but significant victory, a step toward dismantling the entrenched systems of privilege and impunity. Yet even as celebrations erupted across the country, questions lingered. Would the convictions lead to lasting change, or would they fade into memory once the headlines moved on? Could the reforms proposed by Aaron truly address the deep-rooted issues plaguing law enforcement? And most importantly, how could society ensure that no one else endured the kind of humiliation and injustice that Mrs. Devi had faced? In response to these uncertainties, grassroots movements gained strength. Activists organized workshops and seminars to educate communities about their rights and how to file complaints safely. Artists created murals depicting Mrs. Devi's story, turning her experience into a symbol of resilience and hope. Schools incorporated lessons about civic responsibility and accountability into their curricula, ensuring that future generations understood the importance of holding power to account. For Mrs. Devi, the aftermath of the trial brought mixed emotions. On one hand, she felt relief knowing that justice had been served, at least partially. On the other hand, she couldn't shake off the knowledge that countless others remained trapped in cycles of oppression and neglect. Sitting alone on her porch one evening, she reflected on everything that had transpired. Her quiet morning trip to the market had sparked a movement far greater than she could have imagined. Though she never sought recognition, she realized that her story had become a beacon of hope for millions. And so, the fourth chapter of this saga drew to a close, not with finality, but with anticipation. The fight for justice was far from over, but the groundwork had been laid. With each passing day, more voices joined the chorus demanding fairness, transparency, and equality. The seeds sown by Mrs. Devi's courage had taken root, promising to grow into something transformative, a future where no one would suffer in silence ever again. Months after the trial concluded, life began to settle into a new rhythm, not just for Mrs. Devi and her family, but for the entire nation. The convictions of Officer Ramesh and Officer Vikram had sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community, forcing many to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic abuse and corruption. Senior officials implicated in the cover-up had resigned or faced disciplinary actions, signaling a rare moment of accountability in an institution long shielded from scrutiny. Yet, while justice had been served to some extent, the scars ran Deep, for Mrs. Devi, for her family, and for countless others who had endured similar injustices. For Mrs. Devi herself, returning to normalcy proved challenging. Though she tried to resume her quiet routines, visiting the market, tending to her garden, and spending time with old friends, the world around her had changed irrevocably. Strangers approached her on the street to express gratitude or share their own stories of mistreatment. Journalists continued to seek interviews, eager to capture her perspective on the movement that had grown out of her ordeal. While she appreciated the kindness and support, she often found herself yearning for the simplicity of days gone by, when she could walk unnoticed and live without the weight of being a symbol. Her son, Arun Kumar, remained at the forefront of efforts to enact lasting change. The legislative package he introduced gained widespread approval, thanks in large part to the public momentum generated by his mother's case. Mandatory body cameras became standard equipment for all police officers, ensuring transparency during interactions with citizens. Independent oversight boards were established in every district, tasked with investigating complaints of misconduct and holding offenders accountable. Training programs focused on empathy, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques replaced outdated methods that emphasized authority over understanding. These reforms weren't perfect. Implementation faced challenges and resistance lingered among entrenched interests, but they marked a significant step forward. Arun also spearheaded initiatives aimed at fostering trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Community policing programs encouraged officers to engage with residents outside of formal duties, building relationships based on mutual respect rather than fear. Town hall meetings provided platforms for open dialogue, allowing citizens to voice concerns directly to those in power. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. Police departments that had once been seen as adversaries started earning back a measure of goodwill, though much work remained to be done. Meanwhile, grassroots movements inspired by Mrs. Devi's story continued to thrive. Activists organized campaigns to educate people about their rights, distributing pamphlets and hosting workshops in schools, workplaces, and community centers. Artists created murals depicting scenes of resilience and unity, transforming blank walls into powerful reminders of the fight for justice. Musicians composed songs celebrating courage and solidarity, their lyrics resonating with audiences across generations. Even social media played a role, with hashtags like #JusticeForAll and No More Silence, keeping the conversation alive and inspiring new waves of activism. One particularly impactful initiative was led by a group of young students who called themselves Voices Unbound. Determined to honor Mrs. Devi's legacy, they launched a nationwide campaign to document stories of police misconduct and share them anonymously online. Their goal was twofold: to amplify marginalized voices and to create a database of evidence that could be used to advocate for further reforms. Within months, thousands of accounts poured in, each one adding to the growing demand for accountability. The project caught the attention of international organizations, which praised it as a model for grassroots advocacy. Back in her hometown, Mrs. Devi watched these developments with a mix of pride and humility. She never sought recognition, yet she couldn't deny the impact her experience had made. One evening, sitting on her porch with Arun and Meera, she reflected aloud. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said softly, gazing at the stars. "But if my suffering can help others find their voice, then perhaps it wasn't in vain." Her words struck a chord with her children, who had witnessed firsthand the toll the ordeal had taken on her. For Arun, it reinforced his commitment to fighting for justice, not just as a politician, but as someone deeply rooted in the values of compassion and fairness. For Meera, it strengthened her resolve to support victims of abuse, volunteering her time to counsel those seeking legal assistance. Together they vowed to keep pushing forward, knowing that true change required sustained effort. As time passed, the memory of the scandal began to fade from the headlines, replaced by newer issues demanding attention. But its effects lingered, woven into the fabric of society. Citizens grew more vocal about holding authorities accountable, refusing to accept excuses or empty promises. Lawmakers proposed additional reforms, addressing not only policing, but also broader issues like economic inequality and access to education. Grassroots organizations expanded their reach, tackling problems ranging from healthcare disparities to environmental degradation. The movement sparked by Mrs. Devi's case had ignited something far greater, a collective awakening to the power of unity and perseverance. On a personal level, Mrs. Devi found solace in small moments. A neighbor stopping by with fresh fruit, children laughing as they played cricket in the lane outside her house, the smell of rain on parched earth. These simple pleasures reminded her of what truly mattered: connection, kindness, and hope. Though she still carried the emotional weight of her experience, she chose to focus on the positives, the lives touched, the conversations sparked, the seeds planted for a better future. In the end, Mrs. Devi's story became more than just a tale of injustice. It became a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Her quiet dignity in the face of humiliation had inspired millions to stand up against oppression. Her courage had paved the way for reforms that would benefit generations to come, and her unwavering belief in fairness and integrity had reminded everyone that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. Years later, historians would look back on this period as a turning point, a moment when ordinary people rose up to challenge the status quo and demand a fairer, more equitable society. Textbooks would highlight Mrs. Devi's name alongside other trailblazers who had fought for justice. Statues might even be erected in her honor, immortalizing her as a symbol of hope and resilience. But for now, Mrs. Devi simply lived her life, content in the knowledge that she had played a part in shaping a brighter future. As she walked through the bustling market one sunny morning, basket in hand, she noticed something different. Vendors greeted her warmly, not with pity or reverence, but with genuine affection. Children waved at her, their smiles bright and unguarded. It was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes about how far things had come. And so the 5th chapter of this saga drew to a close, not with grand fanfare, but with quiet optimism. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, twists, and turns. But thanks to Mrs. Devi and countless others like her, the journey toward justice had begun, and there was no turning back.